it's Beth. Welcome back to the DeClerc Homestead channel. I'm not at the homestead today. I'm actually at my parents' property. Took a little walk through the woods to not only just take in all of the incredible fall colors that they have here that we don't get at our property because we don't have a lot of woods. Today's video is going to be talking about how I calculate how much meat we need for an entire year for our family. I actually made a printable calculating tool last spring and I shared it on Instagram, but I thought I would kind of expand it in a video to explain it a little bit more thoroughly, but then also share with you guys that are here and not on Instagram, and maybe you'll find it helpful as well. I do want to say that you can use this tool even if you're not growing your own food. So you can use this method to calculate growing, buying, hunting, fishing, or even a combination of the three to figure out how much you need to have stored away. A little back reasoning on why you would even maybe have this as a goal. Everybody has different motives for storing large quantities of anything, whether it be food or toilet paper or gas cans. The biggest reason why we focus on storing large quantities of food is actually twofold. So first of all, we like to know where our food is coming from as much as possible. That ends up meaning that we are growing a lot of it ourselves, and we can only do that in certain times of year. We can't grow tomatoes in the middle of winter. We can't do meat chickens in the middle of winter. So we have to do those seasonally and then factor in the fact that it needs to last us until the next season. The second reason why I like to have a good stockpile of food is the security of knowing that if something were to happen, like my husband couldn't go to work, that people would still have something to eat. We have a lot of people that we are responsible for nourishing, and just like people like to have an emergency fund in the bank of, several months worth of their expenses, for us, it's more comforting to have a security fund of a large pantry, an extended pantry, so that way, if we have to go bare bones in our budget, we don't have to utilize the minimal income that we have to feed people. So those are my two motivations. Other people have different motivations. Some people, especially ones that are buying it, they just prefer the saving money by getting large amounts. Some people are motivated by economic crisis or zombies. I'm just kidding. But for us, it's mainly those two things of just a backup plan in case we lose our income for a period of time and being able to know where our food comes from. Okay, so now that we have those kind of laid out, let's talk about how do you even figure, if you've only ever been shopping weekly or even monthly, how do you determine how much you need for an entire year for your family? This is something that when we first started growing and preserving a lot of our own food or storing it in bulk, I did not really find a resource for. My method of figuring it out has really just come from trial and error, raising a certain amount, seeing if it was enough, and then adjusting based on what I actually saw play out. So there are 3 different steps. The first step is determining what different types of meat your family consumes, whether it is pork or chicken or beef or venison or salmon or moose. If you never consume venison, then don't put it on the list. If you eat a ton of rabbit or lamb, make sure that's on the list. But make a list of the different types of meat that you would ever consume, even if it's not frequently. After that, try to determine how many times, either per week or per month or per year, you are eating each type of meat. So for example, our family, we like lamb, but it's new to us and we don't have a good source for it, so we don't eat it that frequently. But we do like to have lamb between 2 and 3 times a year. Taking that information, determine how many meals in an entire year are you going to be eating each type of meat. So for lamb, I'm going to put 3. We only eat it 3 times a year. perfect. You can do this exercise with all meals that you can consume, or you can do them just with like your dinner and your lunch, or even just your dinner. I mainly am doing it with just my dinner, but then I will round up my numbers a little bit to factor in that we eat meat for lunches as well. But oftentimes when I make dinner, I am trying to make enough that I can carry it into or recycle it into a lunch the next day. So depending on your family size, you can decide, are you gonna do lunch and dinner, meaning that you have 14 meals a week to consider, or are you just gonna do dinner and then fill in your gaps with lunch with what's left over? There's no right or wrong. Whatever makes most sense for your meal planning and your brain, do that. Once you have your totals for each type of meat, then you need to figure out if you are gonna be utilizing animals whole or with poundage. So if you're using smaller animals like rabbits or chickens, and you most frequently eat them whole, it's super easy because you're just gonna multiply your number of meals times the animal, and that gives you your amount. So if you eat whole chicken once a week, you need 52 chickens for the entire year. Same with rabbits, same with turkeys. If you're only gonna have turkey twice a year on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, you only need 2 turkeys. Those are the easy ones. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is when you are working with your poundage. The nice thing about the chart that I made is that this is where it's really gonna help you calculate based on your family's specific needs. Some people only have 2 kids and they're under the age of 5, whereas we have 7 children and they range from 0 to 13. So eating chicken 3 meals a week is going to be very, very different for us than it is for a family of 4 that has 2 littles. So the first thing that I do is that I take how many meals I'm going to have of the type of meat and I multiply it by how many people I'm going to be feeding. Now, I have 9 people, but I mentioned 2 of them are little, they don't eat at all or eat really, really little. So I only really calculate for about 7 people's worth of consumption of my average amount. So for chicken, if I figure we are going to eat chicken once a week, 52 times 7 people is 364 meals of chicken. Now you need to decide what is the average amount of meat per person per meal. Most of our meat is bone-in. The only time we really ever have not bone-in meat is when we're doing like boneless, skinless chicken breast or ground pork or ground beef. So I factor about 3/4 of a pound per person per meal. So I take that 364 and I multiply it by 3/4 of a pound or 0.75. And that means that I need 273 pounds of chicken for my family if we want to eat it 1 meal each week. So now what do you do with that number? Now I can utilize that number and I can divide it by what I know the average weight is of chickens that we raise. And if you don't raise them yourself and you buy them locally, you can get the numbers from the person you're buying it from. Or if you're just buying it directly from the store, then you can use that number as you're buying and subtract your individual totals of each packet of chicken. Finish the example for me, 273 pounds, and we have about a 5-pound average for our chickens. So that means that we need 55 or so birds a year to eat it once a week. If you follow me on Instagram, you know that I've mentioned before, we need 100 birds per year for our family. And that is because we do eat chicken twice a week typically. And if we're not eating it twice every single week, we're utilizing it for lunches. So 100 chickens a year is kind of the sweet spot for our family at its current size. So that's always our goal. And that's how many we raised the last few years. And it's ended up being the perfect amount. We don't have a ton left over, but we're not running out months before we're butchering the next batch. So you can do this step for any of the animals that you're getting. I know it's a little bit more challenging if you are doing larger animals like a pig or a deer, something that has a more of a kind of a varied weight, but this gives you somewhat of a guideline. And if you're buying the food locally or you're buying it, you can know that if you see a sale on ground beef and you have the potential to get 100 pounds of it, you can use these numbers to kind of verify whether or not that's excessive or if you would go through it in a reasonable amount of time. Now, a couple quick notes beyond the calculation part of this. How do you know how much you're going to use of each cut of meat? Or if you are raising animals, what do you do with like the less desirable cuts, the not fancy steaks, or just things that your family doesn't really prefer? I think there's two ways about this. The first is that there's an adjustment when you are homesteading and you are raising animals, or even if you're buying whole animals versus buying cuts. And that is the acceptance that you value that animal's sacrifice and their life enough that you're going to utilize as much of it as possible, even if it's not parts that you prefer. And this is just something that takes practice over time. I know that it was really, really hard for us initially 10 or so years ago when we started buying meat this way, but now we just know that we have to kind of like reserve things. And you can't fly through all of the bacon in the first 2 months because we will not buy more bacon. And this was the first year that I actually didn't have enough and I'm out of bacon. So I'm not going to have bacon for about 6 weeks. The only time that we really have struggled with this is things like pork ribs, because we typically don't have more than 2 or 3 pigs for an entire year. And it takes a lot of ribs to feed a family our size. So having a meal like pork ribs is a really, really special occasion because it only happens like twice a year. You really just get to appreciate having those specialty cuts because you don't just have them in an unlimited quantity. My other tip for this is that, especially if you are butchering yourself, but even if you're paying to have somebody butcher your animals for you, is to just not get the cuts that you don't like. We, strangely enough, don't really love ham. We don't eat a ton of ham besides like the occasional, lunch meat type situation. We don't love ham. So more often than not, when we are processing our own pigs, we are just grinding that entire portion of the animal to make more sausage because that's what we want. You could do that with pork chops. You could do that with flank steaks. If you don't like them, make them into something that you do like and that you will actually use. The wonderful part about working with whole animals is that it really forces you to try a variety of cuts that you maybe wouldn't normally. I had actually never cooked chicken thighs until like our 6th or 7th year of raising meat chickens. It just was not a cut that I ever bought. And when we started raising them, we mainly cooked them whole. And then when we started parting them out, we were doing leg quarters. And just finally in the last 2 years, we've parted the drums from the thighs so that I have that cut of meat on its own. I don't know that I would have ever bought leg thighs otherwise. So having the whole animal really forces kind of creativity and diversity in what you're cooking and what you're trying. If you are looking to kind of get more intentional about having a stockpile of all your family's meat needs for the year, my biggest recommendation is to start with one type of animal or one type of meat and work on that versus trying to get everything at once, because that can be very costly and very overwhelming. So it was really easy for us to just buy a whole pig from a farm, make it last a year, and that was all we did for several years. Then we started raising our own chickens, and we would have a whole pig from somebody, maybe 2, plus our chickens. And it's really just been in the last probably 2 or 3 years that we've been able to sustain ourselves about 90 to 95% of the meat that we consume. We are actually growing, and very rarely am I buying things from the store. The only time that I am buying meat, it is like specialty things that we have not mastered making, like salami or beef jerky, that kind of stuff. Another tip is that if you are raising your own and you're going to rely on consuming exactly what you raise, always err on the side of caution and plan to raise more than you need to account for some loss. So if we need to have 100 meat chickens, I will buy 110 or 120 even, just so that I for sure at a minimum have that 100. And if I end up having a few extra, then I can just sell those, or if I have the room in the freezer, I will keep them as a buffer to just put me a little bit more ahead for the next year. The next obvious question when you're figuring, okay, this is how much meat I need either of each specific animal or as a whole for our family, how do you store that? And there's basically 3 different options that we use. We use our freezer, we use canning, and we are trying to get into shelf stable options, both dehydrating and salt curing, though that's still a learning process for us. The way that you store your meat, again, it just is a matter of your family's preferences, both in what do you prefer the taste of, what do you prefer the convenience of. I freeze the majority of my chicken because I don't prefer the taste of canned chicken, and the effort that it takes to can chicken isn't worth it for me. However, we can all of our venison because it makes it so tender, so much more palatable, and it's super convenient to have stewed venison, just chunks, or ground venison that is thawed and ready to use right away. I think that it is important to have diversity in your food storage for your meats because things happen. And I have definitely had situations where a freezer was left open and things thawed out, and I had to deal with them quickly. In the most recent situation, which was I lost my final shelf of chicken about 2 months before we were going to be refilling it. And so I ended up canning it and just putting it on the shelf. That way I didn't have to worry about having it take up freezer space. Having it on the shelf forces me to use it more quickly, and I'm thankful that I have that skill and that ability to happen in those situations. Another way that we kind of protect ourselves security-wise from a freezer malfunction or a power outage is we have a generator sufficient to power all of our freezers if we have an extended power outage during a warmer month of the year where we need to keep things cool, because depending on the time of year, it might be too much to can. We might not be physically able to can as much as is in there. So in a situation where it's a small amount of meat, I usually will just can it up and preserve it a different way. But in situations where it's like we just processed 3 pigs and every single bit of it is in there, we want to keep the freezer going. We keep a generator so that we can have that comfort in those situations, not risk losing them. One thing that is on my list to get that I haven't yet, but I really need to, is a sensor for our freezers. Something that will alert me on my phone if the temperature gets above a certain point, whether it's because the door is left open or because the power went out and I didn't realize it. But if you are worried, you can get sensors that are really not even that expensive, so that way it can keep you notified if there is an issue before it becomes extreme and completely unusable. I hope that this was helpful in your planning and preparing to maybe amp up your family's meat storage and quantities that you keep on hand. If you want to get this free printable, I will put a link in the description to this video to where you can download it. It does require doing a little bit of math, but I'm working on getting an updated version that you can just kind of plug in the numbers and it does it for you. If I missed anything and you guys have questions, please post them in the videos below. Otherwise, I hope that you're having a great week. I hope that you have beautiful fall colors around you that you get to enjoy. And I will talk to you guys next time.